perhaps it's better that the king is wearing a tie rather than making a kind of public intervention, as we know he has done in the past, or writing a letter, one of his famous interventions, his spidery letters.
What are you hearing about what we can expect from Boris Johnson?
Pretty much what you would expect from him, really. I mean, he has to temper some of what he says to the inquiry, because the amount of criticism that's already been levelled at the Prime Minister from the likes of Dominic Cumming and Lee Cain, who are obviously involved in his sort of press machinations when he was Prime Minister, are fairly extensive. So he needs to address some of those criticisms, as well as those that have been levelled at him by the scientists. People suggesting that he locked down too quickly, that he was a shopping trolley, and that he kind of veered around and effectively made decisions based on what the last person he'd seen has told him, which is often some of the criticisms that we hear of Boris Johnson. But he's going to kind of take some of it on the chin, but I think push back quite heavily on other things, suggesting that actually he did get the big calls right, that he did get the calls right when we went into lockdown, those momentous days when basically the whole country shut down. And so I think it will be sort of more and more and more of the same.
I mean, the main criticism of him so far, to sort of try and sort of narrow it down, has been less about the decisions he took and more about the chaos he represented and the decisions he didn't take, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there have been some suggestions. For example, Matt Hancock's evidence that we locked down too late. I think some of that is almost become kind of indisputable, that the evidence was there much earlier than perhaps we knew about, that they knew that the lockdown was coming, and that he did have a shift of opinion, given that we were originally pursuing some kind of herd immunity sort of response to it, and then suddenly we shifted tack and decided to do the kind of contain sort of challenge. But yeah, you're right. I mean, a lot of the most kind of colourful and more sort of entertaining of the evidence has been that he did preside over a kind of decision-making process that was largely done by WhatsApp, often with fairly colourful language from everybody, and not the kind of way in which you would expect government to be run.
Yeah, I mean, look, as I said, we'll be talking more about the COVID inquiry after 12 with Dr. Phil Hammond. But we also, alongside Matt Hancock, we had Dominic Raab and Michael Gove also giving evidence this week. Were there any big surprises in there with any of it? Or is this inquiry actually becoming the sort of much more sort of functional sort of inquiry that it perhaps should always have been, rather than being a sort of grandstanding gotcha inquiry? I
think the fact is, at the beginning of this inquiry, we were quite excited by what we were hearing. It was quite sort of new and you know, the fact that all of this information was being raked over, private messages that the public wouldn't normally be privy to on the phones of our sort of most top-ranking politicians, was quite interesting. I think now we've been kind of so overwhelmed with information, and the kind of narrative of it has become so kind of obvious that it was sort of crisis-laden and, you know, sort of crazy kind of political world that almost nothing shocks me anymore. So it kind of just feels like it's a sort of something going on in the background. Now, obviously, the families of those that were affected and the families of those that died are sort of following this very closely, and I think will be absolutely and rightly alarmed by what they're hearing. But given the kind of knowledge that we had of what was going on at the time, and indeed what we've heard subsequently, as I say, I'm not desperately surprised that it was as shambolic as it appears to have been.
Okay, let's move more to the present day and talk about the Elgin Marbles. Particularly, let's talk about King Charles's tie at COP28, where he wore a Greek flag on his tie. What do you think about I mean, this is obviously making a political statement. What do you think about the King doing that? It's not like Rishi Sunak can hit back. It's not like Rishi Sunak can wear a Harry and Meghan tie, you know, and not say anything about it. Do you think this is the sort of story that it seems it's sort of being sort of treated as a bit of a joke, but this is the sort of story that in the past would have been like, no, this is quite a big deal. This is the monarch criticising the government, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, yes. I mean, I have to admire the King in many ways. I mean, this is the kind of thing that his mother, the Queen, would have been, you know, very, very sort of careful not to do. She
did wear that EU hat, didn't she?
She did wear the EU hat, but I mean, if you remember the big storm over the story, which was that Queen backs Brexit, you know, some suggestion that she had actually vocalised the idea that leaving the European Union was something that she wished to see. I mean, the royal family, by and large, do not like to be dragged into political discussions, political conversations. Of course, it's not the first time that the king has involved himself in something. We know that he's been privately quite critical about the government's plans on Rwanda.
Very much so, yeah.
And has clearly been sort of galvanised by some of the things that have been said by the Archbishop of Canterbury, with whom he is quite close. But I think it's quite extraordinary that he would go to a meeting of world leaders and effectively wear an emblem, as it were, that would suggest his support for a different nation in a diplomatic route with the Prime Minister. But yeah, I mean, extraordinary, really.
Do you think? Is it going to lead to anything? Is it going to lead to sort of frosty relations between the palace and the Prime Minister, or do you think Rishi Sunak is just going to kind of pretend it didn't happen?
I guess they just pretend it didn't happen. I mean, as I say, it's the protocols of sort of royal life are that this shouldn't happen. And, perhaps it's better that the king is wearing a tie rather than making a kind of public intervention, as we know he has done in the past, or writing a letter, one of his famous interventions, his spidery letters. Look, I mean, I think it's difficult to know exactly what relations are like between prime ministers and their courtiers. We know that the Queen, for example, got on with certain prime ministers better than others. She was a big fan of John Major, for example. It's difficult to know exactly how he gets on with Rishi Sunak because those meetings are privately guarded, and nobody is ever supposed to discuss the contents of them. So you'll never know. But I mean, it's an interesting indication of perhaps what he thinks about the way in which the slightly tempestuous Prime Minister may have behaved on this particular occasion.
What a very strange country we are. You just sometimes get a flash of it, don't you? Look, sticking in Dubai and moving away from matters of ties to the perhaps slightly more important matters of the heat death of parts of the world due to climate change. Rishi Sunak was there for just over 12 hours in Dubai. Was his flying visit deemed a successful one, do you think?
Well, it's interesting that he went at all. We have had instances where our prime ministers have not gone. And so the fact that he actually turned up, I think, is to be welcomed and will be welcomed. Look, it's not a very long period of time, and I think it's interesting that the king and indeed the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, has chosen to take a longer time in Dubai to sort of amplify the messages around what we want to see in terms of climate change. The Prime Minister himself is saying, don't judge us on the hours we spend in Dubai, but actually on our actions. I think that's quite a difficult argument for him to make at the moment, given that we've seen some of those commitments to reaching net zero weakened quite recently. But what he's actually said while he's been there has been a kind of doubling down on Britain's commitment to deal with the climate change issue. But I do wonder how much Britain's standing in the world has been damaged in terms of this particular agenda by some of the kind of posturing that has been done on those particular green issues. If you think about the kind of politicking that was done around the ULEZ instance with Uxbridge, and then obviously that speech that he did, which everybody sees as a kind of overtly political stance to try and open up dividing lines with Labour. And that's not particularly edifying.
Yeah, the vibe doesn't look sort of global leader on that front, does it? Look, how worried are Conservatives about a threat from the right? Because a lot of the stuff Rishi Sunak does, whether it's the Elgin Marbles stuff, whether it's a lot of the environmental stuff, seems to be based on this idea of a challenge from the right that they're keen to head off. We also have Nigel Farage in the jungle. It might seem absurd to treat that as a sort of big political story, but is there concern about a Farage-style comeback that affects the Tories in some kind of way, that is an assault on the right, that this all kind of feeds in together?
Well, it'd be interesting to know just how much this is feeding into sort of number 10's thinking. I think certainly amongst backbench MPs, sure, it's definitely on their horizon. I mean, at the moment, Reform UK, which Nigel Farage is the honorary president of, is polling at between 10 and 15%, depending on which poll you look at. That is a substantial rise from where it was only a year ago, when it was struggling to kind of get to 5% in the polls. And of course, this phenomenon is not something that we haven't seen before from similar parties, including its predecessor, the Brexit Party. We've heard posturings from the leader of Reform UK saying that he is preparing to announce candidates that will stand in as many seats as possible, and that they won't do what was done previously by the Brexit Party and stand back in exchange for some kind of deal with the Conservatives, which does lead to a very real prospect that the vote could be split, particularly in some of those red wall seats, effectively allowing Labour in particular to come up the middle. And so, I think there are worrying signs about that. However, and it is a big however, We don't know exactly how many candidates will stand. Can we really trust that they won't do a deal with the Conservatives, by saying, if you do A, B, C or D on Rwanda, or you do something on taxation, or one of their other major priorities, that they won't stand aside. Remember, they said all this before during the Brexit wars, that they wouldn't stand aside, and then they did. And equally, when push comes to shove, are people necessarily going to vote for a party that won't deliver on an MP and will basically be a protest vote? All of those questions are still very much in the ether and have not yet, I don't think, been conclusively answered.
Where are the Tories generally, senior Tories? How are they thinking at the moment? Are they in sort of like the world is ending mood? Or are they, I know because there was a sort of like a small wobble in the polls, and now they've sort of returned to the usual pattern of just slumping and slumping. Is there any cheer among senior Conservatives, or do they think this is, we're gazing down the barrel here?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, hearing about some of the things that were said by Will Tanner in Spad School yesterday, which was reported in the Times this morning. A suggestion that they don't believe the polls, that they think that they've somehow got it wrong and that it can't be as bad as it's being made to seem. Now, of course, we all expect that the polls will narrow as we head towards an election. There's still a great swathe of people that perhaps don't know how they're going to vote, that are maybe going to sit on their hands and might decide at the last moment. But when you do speak to the backbenchers, no, there's not a lot of Christmas cheer there at the moment. I mean, if I had £1 for the number of times a Conservative MP had said to me, no, it really has hit rock bottom now. This week something's happened and we're now definitely in the death spiral, I'd be a rich woman. It's been happening most weeks for the last couple of months. And every week it feels like they've kind of hit a new low. I mean, at the moment, there's a lot of confusion about what's going on with the Rwanda policy after that interview last weekend by the new Home Secretary saying it wasn't the be-all and end-all, and exactly how that sort of feeds into their thinking about the government's ability to deliver on some of its key pledges. Now, I spoke to a very prominent backbench right-wing Tory MP this week who was in a slightly more forgiving mood, particularly on Rwanda, and actually said he thought that what the Prime Minister had done was to pick action on illegal migration because they thought it was going to be easier than doing something on legal migration. They've now seen that sort of presumption is wrong, and the feeling is amongst some of them that if the Prime Minister came up with a really convincing and solid package on legal migration, that's following those record figures in the last couple of weeks, that might actually do a lot to win over some of those waverers.